in those days just exploded with poetry. And the American poet Billy Collins was asked, like, why is this phenomenon happening? And he said it's because poetry tells the story of the human heart. It's like when words fail, poetry, even with its words, can open this pathway to our soul. It's also been said that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. So I want to push against that idea that this is an elitist art form and just put aside the fact that you can get a book that explains every line in every poem ever written. And imagine that poetry always has room for you. Like always room for your interpretation, for you to show up and be part of it, and somehow the story of the poet, the words of the poet can mingle with your own and take on new meaning. Perhaps good poetry is a bit like good humor in that it is both particular and universal at the same time. You may have known that 27% of the Bible is poetry. I suppose that's largely attributable to the Psalms that go on and on and on. But I didn't know that there are only 7 books in the Bible that you can say have absolutely nothing resembling poetry in them. I didn't go through to check my facts, so I welcome you coming back next week and telling me I got it wrong, but look for the 7 books that don't have poetry. Think in the Gospel of Mary's Magnificat, "My soul magnifies the Lord." Think of the opening words to John's Gospel. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And think of one that I need to read from my page, but I really want to include, Song of Solomon. "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine." Yeah, there's even erotic love poetry in the Bible. So this focus on poetry, my real hope is just that awareness that God is still speaking, that yes, God speaks through our sacred texts and through poems and through movies and through conversations we have with one another, still at work in our lives, and just to really open us. Where is God's voice coming through in your life at this moment? And so today, we studied 2 weeks ago T.S. Eliot. Last week it was Mary Oliver. Today we look at Rupi Kaur. And I don't really want to test you, but I do want to know who's heard of Rupi? Yeah, anyone who listens to CBC Radio or anyone under 35? So I don't expect most of you to know who Rupi Kaur is, a 26-year-old from Brampton, Ontario, and her picture should be there behind me. Beautiful young woman. She was born in India and moved to Canada when she was 3. She's the eldest of 3 kids in a really close-knit family. And she's very much a poet of our time. Her work resonates particularly with young women, but with a whole lot of people in a younger generation. Let me give you some of her stats. She first self-published, I'm going to need that book at some point, Leo, so just hand it up to me now. Self-published her first book, Milk and Honey, in late 2014, and she sold 15,000 copies. And then a publisher took the book on, and it's since sold 4.5 million. It's been translated into 40 languages. And it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for a solid 3 years. Who knew? Who knew that could be going on and you'd never heard of her? Her latest collection, The Sun and Her Flowers, is also a raging success. But Kaur mostly reaches her audience through her posts on Instagram, where she has nearly 4 million followers on that social media platform. And there you'll see she posts photographs of herself. Often they're polished, like the ones I've chosen for today, but sometimes they're more casual. There's a picture there of her with Gloria Steinem or with someone she met at a poetry reading. And she also puts on her on the Instagram the poems and also these really beautiful, simple line drawings that she creates herself. And so I'm going to read for you a few of her poems with the expectation that we don't all know her. So before we get into the one I'm going to look at today, I'm going to read a few for you. "What terrifies me most is how we foam at the mouth with envy when others succeed, but sigh in relief when they are failing. Our struggles to celebrate each other is what's proven most difficult in being human." And this one, I stand on the sacrifices of 1 million women before me, thinking, what can I do to make this mountain taller so the women after me can see farther? And then I have one more poem I want to read that's not on the screen, that my daughter found for me. This is my daughter's book, not mine. But my mom went and bought the companion book because she loves this poetry so much. So here's another one. Most importantly, love. Like it's the only thing you know how at the end of the day. At the end of the day, all this means nothing. This page, where you're sitting, your degree, your job, your money, nothing even matters except love and human connection. Who you loved and how deeply you loved them, how they touched the people around you, how you touched the people around you, and how much you gave them. And so it's been said that Rupi Kaur is never going to win a Pulitzer Prize. Her work has not stood the test of time. It doesn't have the complexity of T.S. Eliot. She doesn't tap into nature images with the skill of Mary Oliver. But hers is the work of a time and a people and a generation. And I feel it's really worth 20 minutes of our time to give a listen to what this voice of vulnerability is speaking into our common world today. There's this raw, down-to-earth vulnerability in what she writes. It's almost as though you could just sit and have a cup of tea with Rupi Kaur. And in fact, that's how she talks about her fans. She meets people at poetry readings. It's like their stories become hers. She has this really close relationship with people who listen to her. She's also fearless. She doesn't look for controversy, but it comes to her. She went from being a poet to a superstar because she dared to post a poem and photographs about her period on Instagram. Yeah, it made a lot of people uncomfortable. Look for it. It moved her. It was powerful. At least the women, it's like, there's your story on the internet. But what happened is people started saying, well, you don't talk about that. You don't talk about that in public. She doesn't bring on controversy, but it comes to her because she won't shy away from just speaking her truth and talking about life as she sees it. And so here's the poem I want to focus on for today. A child and an elder sat across from each other at a table, a cup of milk and tea before them. The elder asked the child if she was enjoying her life. The child answered, yes, life was good, but she couldn't wait to grow up and do grown-up things. Then the child asked the elder the same question. He, too, said life was good. But he'd give anything to go back to an age where moving and dreaming were still possibilities. They both took a sip from their cups, but the child's milk had curdled and the elder's tea had gone bitter. There were tears running from their eyes. Now, I find that I continually underestimate Rupi Kaur's poetry. When I first read this, I thought, well, maybe she's just trying to say, suck it up and appreciate your lot in life. Just know that wherever you are is where you should be, and don't be longing for days gone by or dreaming about the future, but show up in this moment. But then I kept reading it and reading it some more. And you know how it is with art, you put a different light on it and it just refracts differently. And so this other truth came through to me, which might be a different one than you would find in this poem. But as I was reading it further, I wondered if there was this invitation here to not do as the Apostle Paul suggests and put away childish things, but instead an invitation to not be limited by the limits that the whole wide world keeps trying to constrain you with. What I mean to say is, does the child really long to be grown up so she can do grown-up things? Or is she longing for permission to not be defined by what others say she can do? Does she have this fire in her belly that she's ready to share? Does she keep coming up against a world that says, not old enough, not ready, can't do it yet? And for the elder too, does he long to go back to a time when moving and dreaming was possible? Yeah, quite possibly he does. I don't look forward to the day when I sit down cross-legged on the floor and exclaim, like so many others before me, I can't get up. So it is possible that that's part of the interpretation. But let's look at it from a little different angle. What if the old man in the poem is constrained, just like the girl, by a world that says, you've got nothing to contribute anymore, you're past your prime, make room for those with youth and new ideas? What if he too longs to contribute what he knows he still has to offer? What if he has dreams alive in his heart? And then there's us. What are you waiting for? I'm not suggesting that any of us are sitting crying over sour milk and bitter tea. It's just that if we keep waiting for the right moment to do something, to be something, to feed that fire in our bellies, well, we might be missing out. We might be selling ourselves short. And I'm not asking here about people and their contentment with their lives. It's really a different angle to the question. It's more along the lines of, why do we keep believing that there are limits on what we can do and who we can become and what we can contribute? Why, especially as followers in the way of Jesus, do we keep thinking that there's a shortage of love in this world? It's like that Hopi prayer, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And I actually wonder sometimes if that was part of what Jesus was trying to convey to his often dim-witted disciples. Like, you can call me the Messiah, but you're part of building this kingdom I'm telling you about. So I'd like to introduce Rupi Kaur to the old man in her poem so that she can inspire him and say, here's what it looks like to not be constrained by what the world says. Here's what it looks like to be an adult living on the edge of vulnerability and speaking my truth and daring to dream still. And I'd like to introduce Greta Thunberg to the child in the poem. 16-year-old Greta. Yes, she's not constrained by people telling her that she's still a child. There is a peacemaker choosing daily to live a life, not so much that's grown up, but a life with meaning. Over a year ago, when she started protesting on Fridays, it was just a matter of trying to make those around her understand that the climate crisis was real and mattered to her. Well, this week, of course, she sailed into New York City, into the harbor there with her zero-emission boat that was on loan. And this is, let's talk about a hero of our time. And I will give an aside that I certainly am aware that Greta, just like the poet Rupi, have got a whole lot of pushback on why they're not legit and why they're just seeking fame, and I'm not buying it. But here's what one journalist from The New Yorker wrote about her as she stepped off the boat. Her hair was in a single braid. She had brought her hand-painted school strike sign all the way from Sweden. It seemed like an occasion where the mayor should be present, or a brass band, or dignitaries bearing a fruit basket. But no official delegation welcomed Thunberg. Don't expect a delegation of fans and well-wishers when you're living a life of meaning. Amongst the first words she spoke when she got off the boat that day were, "It's insane that a 16-year-old had to cross the Atlantic to make a stand. Don't expect a delegation when you're living a life of meaning." It's easy. It's easy to sit behind the comfortable limits that have come to define our lives. It's easy to sit behind this is what's possible and what isn't. It's easy to say there are less and less choices before us, and yet our scripture stories tell us no. There is always resurrection possibility. And there's a story from Matthew's gospel, kind of midway through, when he's established himself and his people following, and the disciples, who I call dim-witted, it was in relation to this passage and a few others, they're still not getting it. Jesus is talking about this kingdom of heaven that some people think might be this reality that can come on earth here and now where love and justice reign. And other people imagine that it's something that happens in the end times. But the disciples don't ask about the kingdom of heaven. They ask, Jesus, how do we know who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? At which point, if you know the story, you know that Jesus turned to the crowd and invited a child to come forward. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like this child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Listen to the way this one preacher, Fred Buechner, puts it. Jesus wasn't trying to be sentimental. He was saying that the people who get into heaven are people who, like children, don't worry about it too much. They're people who live with their hands more open than their fists clenched. People who, like children, are so relatively unburdened by preoccupations that if somebody says there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, they're perfectly willing to go and take a look for themselves. Children, he says, aren't necessarily better than other people. But like the child in the emperor's new clothes, they just are apt to be better at telling the difference between a phony and a real thing. The kingdom of heaven is not like sour milk and bitter tea. The kingdom of heaven is not like people who say, I'm just visiting, thanks. The kingdom of heaven is not like a world where we settle for children being silenced and seniors being useless. The kingdom of heaven is like a world where we maintain the childhood gift of being able to discern a phony from the real deal. The kingdom of heaven is a world that's constructed day by day, moment by moment, person by person, by those of us rooted in the grace of God, where we choose again and again and again, because that's how you have to do it in life, where we choose again and again to live with open hands instead of clenched fists, no matter how much we want to clench them. And maybe that's what maybe that's what she's up to with her protests. Maybe in a different way, that's what Rupi is up to with her poetry. Maybe a child doing adult things is no different from an adult doing childlike things. Maybe both are at once. Human beings living life ruled by love instead of fear. Human beings leaning into possibility rather than limitations. Human beings living a life where you show up to the dance and you actually step onto the dance floor, despite the fact that you haven't danced in 40 years, despite the fact that you know for certain you have 2 left feet, despite the fact that you're really afraid no one's going to want to dance with you. Following Jesus demands something of our lives, and I don't mean that at all like a guilt trip, but instead an invitation to prayerfully consider, are you listening to your inner child these days? Are you brushing off responsibility because of fear that your dreams aren't worthy or possible? What if we imagine 16-year-old Greta to be the child that Jesus called forth from the crowd that day? The kingdom of God is like this child, speaking truth in a world of fear. I think it's worth ending with Mary Oliver again. And an invitation to prayerfully consider this week, what is it? What is it you're going to do with your one wild and precious life? Are you going to sit it out, or are you going to dance? Amen.
place of wonder. Get your fill to eat, but always keep that hunger. May you never take one single breath for granted. God forbid love ever leave you empty-handed. I hope you still feel small when you stand beside the ocean. Whenever one door closes, I hope one more opens. Promise me that you'll give faith a fighting chance. And when you get the choice to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance. I hope you dance. I hope you never fear those mountains in the distance. Never settle for the path of least resistance. Heaven might mean taking chances, but they're worth taking. Loving might be a mistake, but it's worth making. Don't let some heaven heart leave you bitter. When you get close to selling out, reconsider. Give the heavens above more than just a passing glance. When you get the choice to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance.
Is a wheel in constant motion, always rolling us along. Tell me who wants to look back on their youth and wonder where those years have gone.
I hope you still feel small when you stand beside the ocean. Whenever one door closes, I hope one more opens. Promise me that you'll give faith a fighting chance. And when you get the choice to sit it out or dance, dance. I hope you dance. I hope you dance.
Time is a wheel in constant motion, always rolling us along. Tell me who wants to look back on their youth and wonder